It's week 2 of 2022. I'm Smitha Nair. This is your weekly fix. In 2019, 3 shootings in Christchurch, New Zealand, San Diego, and El Paso in the US, all deemed incidents of domestic terrorism and carried out by men in their 20s, brought extremist internet subcultures hosted on platforms like 8chan and 4chan into sharp focus. Investigations showed all 3 men had been radicalized, at least in part, by these platforms. These unmoderated message boards are home to neo-Nazis, those propounding the AltRight ideology, conspiracy theorists, and misogynists. Of course, more mainstream platforms like YouTube and Facebook have helped amplify their message. The use of memes and insider jokes or coded language have been ways in which these posts have evaded hate speech checks that exist on some of the more mainstream platforms. Vox, in a piece titled "How the Christchurch Shooter Used Memes to Spread Hate," explains that using memes to normalize unconscionable beliefs and behavior has become an established messaging tool for the far right. It follows a standard method for spreading extremist ideology online by framing its hateful rhetoric as a joke in an attempt to normalize it and make it appear more acceptable. The writer further explains that one of the most significant and pernicious ways that the right-wing extremists use trolling, shitposting, and memes is to distort what their actual message is, so they can claim plausible deniability that their message is harmful or bad. Now, why am I talking about this? Well, the 4 arrested in India last week for their role in the creation and propagation of the apps Bully and Sully Deals, where vocal Muslim women were auctioned online, are all products of a similar ecosystem and use the same methods as their Western counterparts. Codes and memes populate their posts. For instance, a cursory look at several right-wing, far right-wing accounts will show repeated use of the words cauliflower farmer, which reportedly is a dog whistle for the genocide of Muslims. It makes a reference to the Bhagalpur massacre of 1989, where more than 100 Muslims were killed. The perpetrators reportedly planted cauliflowers over the mass grave to hide evidence. Archis Chaudhry of fact-checking website Boom Live, someone who tracked these accounts over time, writes, "Once relegated to the fringe of India's online right-wing community on 4chan and Reddit, these young extremists have grown in terms of number, support, and visibility. They now have a strong presence on Twitter and YouTube, along with Telegram." Archis will join us in a moment to explain what he's learned in the course of his reporting. Also a good time to look at what was described as India's QAnon moment, the so-called Justice for Sushant Singh Rajput campaign that conjured up and fanned some of the most bizarre conspiracy theories in recent memory. Journalist Venkat Anand went down that rabbit hole to uncover the players of that campaign. He joins us a little later on the podcast. Let's get Archis in first. Archis, thanks for making the time.
Of course, anytime.
Archis, from what I understand, these trads, as they're loosely defined, who deal mostly in memes that dehumanize Muslims, Dalits, and women, operated until recently mostly on platforms like 4chan and Reddit and Discord. Is that correct? How long have they been on more mainstream platforms like Twitter and YouTube? And has that move given them more traction? Have their numbers increased?
Yeah, so actually the trads that we are hearing of currently, they're only a small section of a much larger group called trads. Trads in general are Orthodox fundamentalist Hindus, and a portion of them urban, educated, tech-savvy, upper caste. They're called the edgelord trads, and they're the ones that are making so much noise currently.
Yes.
So they've been using technology quite efficiently, using forums like Reddit and 4chan and Telegram to build their community. And these forums are not very often visited by Indians. We don't usually populate these forums much, and that is why they have gone mostly unnoticed until now. But since 2020, they have been moving more and more to mainstream platforms like YouTube, Twitter, and Facebook. And that is when we started hearing of them. In 2020, when the account Liberal Doge did an auction of Pakistani women on Twitter, that is when they really came to surface and people started noticing them. And of course, then there were the two apps that were created by the same group. So as for the size of this group, it's really very, very hard to tell how big they are. According to some non-trad right wingers that I spoke to who are labeled as Raitas, they gave me a figure of around 2,000 trads on the internet, but none of them were able to tell me exactly how they came up with the number. So one thing that I do know, and it was confirmed by one of the trads I spoke to, is that these edgelords have multiple accounts. All of them have many accounts. They could have 10 accounts, 15 accounts each, and that they use all these accounts to really amplify their voice, and which makes them seem much, much more numerous than they really are. And that is how they gather so much traction actually currently.
Right. And how much of their operations are modeled on the American far right online? Pepe the Frog, for instance, which is counted among hate symbols after the far right, the alt-right claimed it and came to be associated with white nationalism, also features in memes made by this part of the Indian far right ecosystem. What are the sort of similarities and differences?
Yeah, so actually, most of their content, their style, their diction have been heavily inspired by the American alt-right. In fact, after Trump's victory, when these alt-right groups, kind of came up in the US, it sort of exploded around the world. And, in India was no different. We had our alt-right moment, I guess, just after that. And, they picked the same memes. You have Pepe the Frog, which is called the Keck meme in the US, and you have very similar words to describe the different sections in this community. You have black pillars, extreme far right people who have given up because they believe that this democratic society can never bring back their values. You have white pillars who still hope for that ancient glorious times to come back. You have some other groups called caterpillars, green pillars, chat pillars.
Okay.
All these groups, the names of these groups have been taken. In fact, the name edgelord to describe these very noisy reactionary group on the internet, even this group has been named after something taken from the alt-right dictionary in the US. So not just the terms, in fact, the ideology, the alt-rights themselves are neo-Nazis, right? So their ideology closely follows the fascist ideas of purity of race, importance of one's duties towards your race and your nations, the cleansing of society, which basically means extermination of races that are seen as impure.
Right.
All these similar ideas have been taken and applied to the Indian context, with India's very own discriminatory practices being imbibed with these neo-Nazi ideas. So this is what we're looking at right now. The discrimination is ours. The casteism and Islamophobia is ours. Even the misogyny is our own.
Archus, in response to the arrest of this young woman and the three men, I saw sympathy in some quarters. The narrative being peddled here was something on the lines of, look, it's just internet nastiness, and arresting and criminally prosecuting them is no way to treat these poor, misguided young men and women. What I want to ask you about is the call to violence. There have been reports of these online communities exhorting followers to arm themselves and purchase weapons.
All these forums and all these techniques, long before the Indian or the American alt-right, ISIS had already used all of these techniques to radicalize people, Muslims all around the world.
Right.
So this is already something that is tried and tested. So if you and one defining a common feature between the American and the Indian alt-right is the fear of genocide of their own race. In the US, it's called the white genocide theory, where they believe that white people are being run over, by either by Mexicans or by various outsiders, and that they need to kind of reclaim their position, or else they'll be kind of annihilated. So that is a very common fear that the American alt-right have. And it's the same with the Indian alt-right. They fear that Hindu khatre mein hai, and they take this sentence quite literally, and they believe that they have to save the civilization. And in order to do so, you need to pick up arms, and protect your dharma. So of course, on public forums, on mainstream platforms like YouTube and Twitter, you will only get to see such violent stuff through memes, and they will maybe not put out things in words too much. But if you go into the Telegram groups, if you follow the Reddit or Discord discussions, then you'll see things get a lot more verbal, and this call to pick up arms and call to violence becomes a lot more clear. Of course, unlike in the US, where people can just pick up a lot of guns and keep them stored at home, in India you don't have the choice. So you have swords and sharp objects. Basically, people are told to collect to keep, in case the day of reckoning comes. And yes, you're right that it can definitely have serious real life consequences, as the Christchurch shooting, the example you gave. That was a result of exactly this, this mass scale radicalization around the world.
Archis, are there specific people or accounts that are viewed in this space as leaders or self-identify as such? How have they been able to sort of dodge the hate speech net that exists on platforms like Twitter and to an extent on YouTube?
Okay, so your first question basically, this entire alt-right movement in India is not really well organized, and they're essentially leaderless. There have been accounts that take up leadership positions. For example, you had this Mithila Bull who became quite popular. This account belongs to that Vishal Kumar Jha, who has been arrested,
right?
Who has been posting incessantly on Twitter. So he got quite popular. You have this account called Ram Bhakt Vedic that we've been following. Whoever runs this account has written for Op India before, and he was the owner of the handle Vedic Revival, who was thoroughly retweeted by a lot of these trad or edgelord trad accounts. So you have certain people, and a lot of Raita people, like the non-trad right-wingers, believe that this account called Bharadwaj Speaks, who used to go by the name True Indology, is like some kind of a leader among these trad groups or these edgelord trad groups. But it's something we haven't really been able to confirm yet. Whether this person holds like a leadership position, except that this user shares a lot of stuff, content related to Hindu scriptures, which are again like retweeted by trad accounts. So it's really hard to say, who the leader is, and I don't really think there are such leaders as such, like who take up these kind of positions. And as for your second questions, how they dodge these hate speech net, they have multiple methods. One method is, of course, like how you use your words. You don't say rape, you say r at the rate. You don't say genocide, you say something else.
Okay.
You use memes to say what you want instead of putting it out in words, which can be very easily identified. So just kind of coding what you're saying, that helps. And another thing that they do is create multiple accounts. So one account gone, the second account pops up, and they just keep going on and on and on. Like there is no stopping these people on how many accounts they could make, basically. And that basically means that you have so many personas, you just take down one, you have the other one popping right up. So these methods are currently the ones that we have been able to identify, them using to really like go around all these nets and still exist and thrive, actually.
Of course, many of our television news anchors have mastered the communal dog whistle. I wonder, Archis, if any of them have fanboys and fangirls in this community.
In mainstream, I wouldn't be able to tell if they have some kind of like a idol in the mainstream news media, any such personality. But I have seen a lot of Suresh Chavanke content being shared in some of these groups. So there's that. I don't know if he would be mainstream. But yeah, the Suresh Chavanke name does pop up a couple of times. And yeah, you have all the typical right-leaning channels, content from these channels being shared, for example, Z. But yeah, nothing like that would suggest, that they are their idols or something.
Well, thanks, Archis, for sharing what you've been able to learn on the subject. Thank you.
My pleasure, and thanks for having me as well.
Okay. Let's speak now to Venkat Anand, who brought us that deep dive into the conspiracy theories surrounding Sushant Singh Rajput's death in his reportage in the Economic Times. Thanks for joining us, Venkat.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Venkat, do you see an overlap in the personalities and accounts that populate this space that we are discussing about and the SSRians, as they call themselves?
I think there is some overlap. I mean, obviously, there are these worlds that a lot of us are probably not exposed to. I think they are happening in spaces that none of us usually end up going to. So, to that extent, I think there is a significant overlap. Also, from a thinking perspective, also from a behavioral perspective, I think both of these. Uh, for a want of a better word, ecosystems, which is sort of very popularly misused, uh, operate like cults. So there is a cult-like top-down thinking. There are grievances. There is this perceived sense of victimhood. There is also this sense of the world is against us. We have to do something, which I think is also a very cult-like behavior. I mean, obviously there is a fierce belief in the causes they are purportedly fighting. So definitely, I think there is some form of overlap, particularly in terms of users, personas. I think I do not see a substantial overlap in that. Having studied one of these ecosystems in depth, but and the other one partially so.
Right.
But like I said, I mean, the only overlap that I can see is that they inhibit very similar spaces online, and spaces that a lot of us may not usually end up going to, which would be Instagram, Discord, Telegram, Reddit. I mean, these are spaces that you'll find a lot of these users.
Okay. For those of our listeners, Venkat, who may not be fully familiar with SSRian theories, can you provide us a couple of examples of conspiracy theories surrounding the actor's death that was peddled, that found great traction online and had even been mainstreamed by news channels?
Of course, I mean, mainstream, so TV news channels obviously had a big role to play. I think it was a very interesting time in the COVID-19 crisis, a pandemic, where people were definitely having there was fatigue, and I mean there were questions being asked about the lockdown and all that, but I mean, and then there was the whole China issue, etc., etc. So I mean, all of these came as very useful fillers for people who sort of saw it that way. I think from a theory perspective, obviously the one that became really uh, viral, and a lot of people started subscribing to it and started getting into even deeper rabbit holes, was one about uh, the fact that there was evidence about Sushant Singh Rajput live streaming his death, which I mean, as laughable as it sounds,
Right.
which people like uh, Akshay Kumar, Salman Khan, and I think Aditya Thackeray were holed up in a place and were watching it live. And then the fact that this live streamed video exists in the dark web and is available for sale on Bitcoin, for Bitcoin. So it just took up the best of all possible conspiracy theories and just put it together.
Right.
I mean, and just sort of made it even bigger. And there were literally people, and it grew because of YouTube. Yeah, I mean, let's be honest. YouTube and Facebook were the force multipliers. On YouTube, there were people who were discussing. I have seen the footage. I have access to this. If you pay me bitcoins, I can probably turn it out to police. I have conclusive proof that this has happened and all that. So obviously, these were the areas that they were trying to hit on. And I mean, there was probably a political angle here because obviously the Maharashtra government was at the time an opposition government, and that one of their allies had switched over to the Congress, NCP. So I mean, Aditya Thackeray was a key factor in this. They used terms like a baby penguin to call him out, and his proximity to Bollywood was obviously a big factor,
Yes.
and so on. And so he was obviously at the heart of it. So that is number one. Number two, obviously, they seem to have studied something around QAnon, where they were talking about child trafficking and adrenochrome harvesting, and how the Maharashtra government, again, it seems to be a key anchor in this theory, seems to be sort of there are missing children and the Maharashtra government is not doing anything to protect them, and we know where they are going. There are people like Salman Khan who are harvesting the tears of children, or something like that. That to some extent also found some traction.
Right. You spoke to individuals who trafficked these conspiracy theories. Can you give us their origin story? I mean, who are these people? Are they demographically similar, those that propound these theories and those who follow them? Did these sort of early adopters learn from their Western counterparts?
Yeah, I think ideological homogeneity is very, very important for a cult like, a cult like movement. Obviously, if I had to divide this quote unquote movement, I would say there were believers who legitimately believed that the guy was murdered. I mean, they had their reasons. But obviously, if you look at the evolution of how this theory began, I mean, obviously how these things started. I mean, a guy commits suicide. There was a few days earlier, his manager dies. And then obviously there is this string of outbursts on social media platforms elsewhere about, he was an outsider. This is about nepo kids. This is about nepotism in Bollywood. So it slowly started acquiring that flavor that, I mean, there were a lot of entertainment journalists, former entertainment journalists who got involved in this. I mean, I've quoted one of them who got very active in this space. Then there's this entire lobby of lawyers who just came in, sudden emergence of these lawyers who, I think Ishkaran Bandari who works very closely with Subramaniam Swamy, or at least used to, or still does, I'm not aware, was one of them who sort of started becoming the face of this movement. I mean, and then you had another character called Vibhor Anand who just came out of nowhere. I mean, if you look at their ideological spectrum, they probably are closer to the right, or slightly further away from the right, I would say. But they all started entering the space. They said, I have updates. And there is this very thirsty population which wants, or a thirsty audience. Like once you're in a cult, you're controlled, right? I mean, you want anything. You want anything and everything about the case. I mean, if there is a Riya Chakrabarti arrest, I mean, there is something there, And I think when all of these people came together and then started, and then his family got involved. I mean, his sister, I believe, was very involved initially. And then there were these other characters. Nilotpal is one of their characters who's very actively involved in the space. He's sort of the, he's the top of the pyramid guy who, from whom instructions flow down, and instructions in a sense to trend stories, to trend hashtags, etc. So a lot of these characters came together. There were people sitting in the US. There was a character called Varun Kapoor who used to sit in California and talk about the case for 2 hours, 3 hours. All of these were being done over Zoom. And then there were random people who, there was a lady called Smitha Parikh, who was his friend.
Right.
Who, again, used to prop up every now and then. And then there were these other online characters. There was a Dr. Padma, or somebody who was in London, who used to just, issue rants every now and then.
Okay. Venkat, your piece, while documenting these conspiracy theories, their origin, etc., you were importantly also giving us an understanding of these technology platforms as vectors of massive misinformation and lies. Your piece focused particularly on Facebook groups.
Yeah, so I mean, Facebook, so it's very interesting, right? I mean, Facebook groups in India, if you look at it from a more behavior or use case point of view, a lot of people would say, you're moving to a new city, you want a place to stay, or you want to find flatmates, or you want to find something of that sort. A Facebook group might come in, or you want a pet adoption. I mean, these were largely the original use cases for a Facebook group. Or if there's a society, if there's a huge apartment complex, people all of them come together, and it functions like a community of sorts. So that was the thinking that everybody had. But obviously, the last, particularly 5-6 years, there has been a substantial focus on political mobilization, not just in India, as you've seen in the US with Jan 6th last year, and the anti-mask movements, the pro-freedom movements, that the three percenters, the oath keepers. These groups have emerged in the US. They always existed, but they never had a platform to congregate. And to that extent, I think Facebook provides a perfect tool. A group is, you can, as I have written in my article, quoting someone I spoke to, who was aware of how these things work. He clearly told me that, boss, कि 10 WhatsApp group का काम एक Facebook group कर सकता है. So you're literally talking about 2,500 people in one group minimum. You can escalate. You can actually multiply that by a 10 and 25,000, and in some cases 100, which is like 2.5 lakh.
Yes, that
is the power of these groups. Now, one of the things that Facebook obviously has been doing is, I think it comes at it from a good faith policy, which is to quote unquote empower admins and give them more powers, as if these admins act in good faith. But the way these groups function, and particularly these groups, is that when you are seeking this purported justice, there is not going to be any space for contrarian information. So if I go and say in one of these groups that Sushant Singh Rajput was not murdered, he committed suicide, the incentive of the admin is not to let a free debate going. Let's debate it out, right? Let what the facts say. It is to, since it's a group and it's all of these in-group, there's an in-group mentality to this. It is to stamp me out. So when you have a group of people, 70,000-80,000 people who are not particularly looking at a free flow of information, which is what Facebook uses as a defense in most cases, which is quote unquote free speech, you're going to end up in these places where all 80,000 people are inclined to believe the same thing. I mean, we have seen groups of over 1 lakh members who are dedicated to this cause. Obviously, there was also a perception that at some point of time they may flip to doing something else. They may flip to, for example, become a I support Narendra Modi kind of a group. But that in some cases or in the big group cases has not happened.
Right.
So I think obviously Facebook has a role to play here, and Facebook, is such a significant platform because, as we all know, for a lot of people in India, Facebook is the internet. I mean, you can say whatever, but it is the platform. It is their window into the internet, and it's as we're also seeing with this, with the Raita, trad case right now. It also becomes, these platforms, particularly Twitter, Facebook, especially with, again, this whole sort of, a structure, information flow structure. It also becomes a platform where people can get radicalized. And in the case of Sushant Singh Rajput, absolutely. I mean, I see them playing a very, very big role in sort of advancing this conspiracy theory.
Okay. I'm going to link to your piece in the description below, Venkat, because there is just so much more to talk here and we don't have the time to cover so much of what you've written in that piece. I want to say thank you for making the time today, Venkat.
Yeah, thanks for having me, as I said earlier as well. So,
thanks also to our listeners. I'll be back next Friday.